Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the journalist and author Anjan Sundaram.
We spoke to Anjan about working as a stringer in the Congo and other assignments in the Central African Republic and Rwanda, about juggling journalism and book writing, and about his latest book, Break Up, about the personal cost of war reporting.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Anjan, to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the show. Could we start with your latest book, Break Up? Could you give listeners a sort of précis of that and when you decided to write it?
Sure. Thank you, Rachel and Simon. I'm delighted to be here speaking with you. I've heard your podcast on several occasions, and I'm happy to be a guest. So yes, my new book is called Break Up, A Reporter's Marriage in a Central African War. And it is about my journey through the Central African Republic as ethnic cleansing or genocide, at the time we thought it was genocide, of Muslims was being prepared. The book is also a memoir, so it's about how my marriage enabled that kind of war reporting and how ultimately the reporting damaged my marriage and led to my breakup. And my story isn't unique. You know, many war correspondents and frontline human rights workers have lived through similar contradictions or difficulties in balancing work and life. And I wrote this book both to sort of document what had happened in the Central African Republic, the immense war there, which hadn't been reported, but also to shed light on what it takes to do this kind of work and the consequences of doing so, which, you know, isn't often discussed in the journalistic community.
A point that's come up in some of the discussion about the book elsewhere has been just how poorly known the Central African Republic is. And I think you alluded to this in the book with editors kind of being baffled by it and things like that. Again, just for the benefit of our listeners, could you give a brief summation of the country and its rather tricky current and past state?
Absolutely. When I wouldn't be surprised if listeners didn't know much about the country. I didn't know much myself. Shortly before setting out on this journey, when I asked editors to fund my reporting on the Central African Republic, they asked me which Central African Republic, not knowing that it was the name of the country, thinking it was a generic stand-in for many of the Central African countries that exist. And that was one of the challenges. So the Central African Republic was a former French colony. I'll go back a little further. It used to be an Islamic sultanate. It was called, there were a bunch of sultanates that ruled that region, the most powerful of which was called the Dar al-Kuti, which means the door to the forest, and was ruled by Rabi al-Zubair. Now, Rabi was killed and beheaded by the French, who took over that region and the rest of Africa as colonialism was on the rise. And while most people have forgotten, much of the world has forgotten about the Muslims and the sultanates that ruled over that region, the Muslim communities in the Central African Republic still remember. And so this war that I reported on was begun by a group of Muslim rebels who decided to take power again, to return to their past glory. And they did succeed. They took over country briefly, but there was such a backlash from the majority Christians in the country that it led to ethnic cleansing and possible, acts of genocide. The Muslim population was reduced from 15% to 9% in the country in the space of, a few months. Muslims were killed even as they sheltered in mosques and as they tried to flee the country. And geopolitically, the Central African Republic, I write in the book that it can seem like a piece of oblivion. My reporting partner, Thierry Mesongo, a journalist, a Central African journalist, told me, and it's probably not untrue, that most people know more about the moon than they know about the Central African Republic. It's that isolated and that remote in our consciousness and in our collective consciousness. And I think geopolitically, it's now important because the country has tried to move away from the West. And in doing so, it's moved closer to Russia and China. So the French have been pushed out, and into that void has entered Russia in particular, and the notorious mercenary group called Wagner, which is now mining for gold and diamonds in the Central African Republic. According to a US diplomatic cable leaked earlier this year, the Wagner Group is making hundreds of millions of dollars in profits in the Central African Republic that they're using to recruit and buy weapons for the war in Ukraine. And it's striking how the Central African Republic has such a strong desire to move away from the West that they're doing so even at the cost of fueling greater war in Ukraine.
I had picked up that line about the moon as well, so I'm glad you brought it up. In terms of, obviously the war was not well known, but when you were researching the country, were there resources available to you that would help inform your understanding of it?
The short answer is no. There weren't many resources that were available to me. There were some research reports written by the International Crisis Group. There was one academic text that had recently been published. There had been some research at French universities, but the last mainstream book that described the country was published 100 years before, in 1927, by André Gide. The book is called Voyage au Congo, so Voyage into Congo. And since then, in the world of publishing, the world of books aimed at the general population, there has been no account of the Central African Republic. Since I traveled there, there's been one comic book by the excellent comic artist, Central African comic artist Didier Kassai. It's called House with No Windows and describes the war. But again, it's a comic book. And so there's no mainstream publication. And that was another intention of mine in writing this book, was to try and, put this country back on the map in literary terms. And in doing so, in some small way, try to expand the boundaries of literature, which for many reasons has excluded the Central African Republic. I believe wrongly so, because the war there is one of the major ongoing wars in our world today. And as I mentioned before, with Russia and the West and shifting geopolitics, I think it is a war of global importance.
And could you talk us through just the events in this particular trip in 2013 that form the heart of the book, and particularly the events that happened in this village called, is it Buka? Is that the pronunciation there? The sort of experiences that you went through, and then we'll get in due course in terms of the experience of writing about it.
Sure. So I traveled to the Central African Republic with a friend and colleague. His name is Louis Mudge. He's a researcher, Human Rights Watch. And we both traveled together after we had heard rumors that a genocide was being prepared, a genocide of Muslims was being prepared in the Central African Republic. We couldn't find out much more than that. We just heard the rumors. We got bits of information that massacres had been perpetrated around the country, but it was very difficult to know who had perpetrated the massacres, when, where, why. All the basic questions that a journalist seeks to answer, we could not answer. We could not find answers to. And even as we called NGOs working, Doctors Without Borders, and groups that are typically quite well informed, didn't know what was happening in the country because the war was so isolated. Radio station antennae had been destroyed across the country. Information wasn't getting out. So we planned a trip, and our purpose was to travel across the country and try to document as many of the massacres as we could. And what we ended up doing was reporting and documenting massacres, driving into towns where massacres had just happened, were happening, or were announced for the next morning, which is what happened in the town that you mentioned, Buka. We arrived at the church grounds in Buka. It's a town north of the capital, Bangui, kind of in the center of the country. And as we were traveling, we would sleep in the churches. We would sleep in the church guest houses, hospitality of the local priest. And we drove up to the church grounds. And as we drove up, a government truck showed up. And we saw that there were thousands of people, 3,000 people in the church grounds taking shelter there. And a government soldier got off the truck, a Muslim soldier, and told the nun, there was an Italian nun running the church, in this surreal encounter, soldier carrying weapons, speaking to a nun across the yard, saying that if you don't clear this ground by 8 a.m, we're going to kill everybody. And our group, which comprised of Louis Mudge, myself, Thierry Messongo, Central African reporter, and our driver, we decided to stay and report on this massacre that had just been announced. And we called all the embassies and we tried to get someone to intervene. And all the embassies said, well, Central Africans are being killed in their hundreds across the country. Why should we intervene for this killing? We can't do anything. And so we thought that, it was a lost cause. Sometime in the middle of the night, Louis told Human Rights Watch that we were there on the grounds where the massacre was to be perpetrated. And Human Rights Watch called the White House, and the White House called the government and said, essentially, the 3,000 people are not our concern, but if anything happens to our guy, you're going to be in trouble. And so the attack was called off. African Union peacekeepers were sent in armored cars to protect the church. It was stark, the difference in value. We saw firsthand that one American life was worth so much more than 3,000 Central African lives. And the Italian nun who had been trying to protect the Central Africans in the church ground, she was distraught because a few months before, there'd been around 150 or 180 people massacred. And she had called the Pope. And even the Pope had been unable to save them. And so in her mind, she said, I called God. And God had not been able to intervene to save these people. And yet this one American man who had showed up in her compound had just saved 3,000 people. She had reconciled herself to sort of the inevitability of the killings in the war. But now suddenly she saw that actually the world does have the power to stop the killing. It's just that the global authorities, world powers, don't use what power they have. They use it very sparingly and only when, their interests are at stake. It was a powerful couple of nights in that church ground.
How do you feel personally in those moments? I mean, in sort of very difficult, confrontational, your life is potentially at risk. Do you find that you can keep a cool head, or is it a bit more complex than that?
No, I think the most important quality is to stay humble, because often I'm a foreign correspondent and I'm traveling through these wars. I'm traveling through places that I've been completely isolated, where the front line is shifting, the dynamics of the war are shifting quite rapidly. And so you have to trust the local people who have lived through that conflict and survived. And so, as I'm driving through, I just stop everywhere I can and ask people, is it okay to go forward? And if they say, oh, we heard a government truck move last night, a small convoy, maybe it's not safe. I really have to turn back, and I try to, take extreme risks in that way. But, that said, sometimes I end up in places such as this church ground where a massacre has been announced. It was surreal to be there and to sort of arrive at the same time that this massacre was announced, to not be able to do anything, to call the embassies. I felt impotent. At the same time, I feel that just being present, I try to set my bar really low. I try to tell myself, just by being present, by being a witness, making sure that the perpetrators of the killing know that someone is watching, I'm serving a purpose. Because a lot of violence, a lot of the gravest violence in these war zones, but even domestic violence inside homes, happens when no one's watching, and when the perpetrators feel that they can get away with attacking others and not be held to account when there's no proof. I see my job as a journalist, one of the primary functions that I serve is just to show up and record as much as I can and publish what I see. And in doing so, let people know that they're being watched, they're being observed. And so hopefully limit and contain and mitigate in some sense the violence. And of course, journalism can do much more than that. Sometimes you can, collect proof of human rights violations that then can go to court and then hold people accountable. If I'm able to do that, then I'm lucky. But I try to set my bar pretty low. And it is, I'm often scared. I just try to not let my fear control my actions.
And the other strand in the book is about your relationship with your wife and the impact of what this experience had on that relationship and how it came to an end. How could you talk us through both what happened there and then, your decision to write about that as well.
Sure, yeah. My ex-wife just read my book. She read my book a couple of months ago, and she pulled me up and said, "Thank you for having portrayed me as nicer than I was at the time." And I thought, well, okay, I've done my job, because I was trying to paint as honest and real picture of what had happened, and I'd been concerned about how she'd feel about my project to include her in the book, and it's ended well. But I really, the impetus for writing about my marriage was that a lot of my reporting, I feel, I can only do from a place of love, of feeling loved, of a stable family life, of feeling that connected to the people closest to me, whether that's my mom or my daughter or my now ex-wife, my friends. I need to travel out from a place in which I feel at home. And often when I'm in the war and I'm thinking about turning back, home is essential, because I need to have some place to which I can return, to which I can turn back. And often, as in this book, I find that I can take small steps and keep moving forward. I don't have to return home, but psychologically, it's essential for me to have such a place where I'm comfortable in order to go out to a place where I don't know much about, that's dangerous, and try to do work there, to report from there. And so I really wanted to convey that sense of love from which I think a lot of reporters work. I don't believe that I'm alone in this. Yet we don't turn the camera on ourselves. As journalists, we're not trained to turn the camera on ourselves. We're often trained to report on others. And when I'm reading a good book or watching a good documentary, I'm often wondering, why is the journalist obsessed with this character? What allowed this journalist to go and do what they're doing? And I wanted to try and answer some of those questions in my book. And again, at the end, I guess, coming to the end of the book, my work then damaged and hurt my relationship. I think maybe, there are fundamental contradictions between doing this kind of work and trying to build a stable family life. And this was even the case for me, given that my ex-wife had also been a war correspondent. We'd met on the front line of the war in Congo. She knew exactly the kind of work I was doing. We'd decided together to have a child. We talked about it a lot, talked about me continuing to do my work, my war reporting. And so she was very well informed as anyone could possibly be. And yet, even for her, it became too much to have a husband and a father continue to do this kind of dangerous work and possibly not return, which is always a possibility, even though I'm very careful, and I have been always very careful. It is still a possibility more than in other lines of work. And so I wanted to convey some of the difficulties of trying to balance both these worlds. And in the sense that my story isn't unique, I don't have a prescription, a solution, but I do believe we need, as foreign reporters, as war correspondents, I do believe that we need to talk about this more. And this book is my small contribution to that conversation, to opening up that conversation, to breaking through what is a culture of machismo, very male-dominated culture in war correspondence, whereby reporters don't often talk about the families, the chaos, the personal destructions that we experience, and our work is seen as kind of public service of the highest order and very brave work and worth sacrificing for. And yet we don't talk about those sacrifices. It's only beginning to be spoken about in journalistic circles and journalistic trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder among journalists. And these are topics that are quite new. And certainly when I was, learning journalism, they weren't mentioned at all. I think we should speak about them more and more.
It's something that has been broached a little bit on this show with other war correspondents, but I agree it's something that probably should be talked about more. You mentioned showing the book to your ex-wife, but was that after you finished it and it was pretty close to publication, or was it a bit earlier on in the process?
So I shared different sort of drafts and outlined with her at various points. I was reluctant to share with her the exact words, and I was worried that somehow she would censor me. Or that I wanted to retain as much as I could as the sense of freedom in the writing, but at the same time inform her. And I remember, maybe 6 months before I finished the final draft, I sort of shared with her the story as it had played out in the book. And there was only one point at which she said, that's not true. And I thought, well, that's pretty good, I think, post-divorce to have her agreement on 95% of the story. And, the one place was my perception of how things had ended. And obviously we would, it would be normal for us to have differing accounts. And I'd be personally interested to read her account of, what happened and how she felt that the marriage broke down. Because obviously communication broke down, understanding broke down, even though we'd been together for 10 years, we'd traveled through wars, we had reported on, repression, dictatorships. We'd experienced a lot together, and I felt I knew her better than almost any person in the world. And yet we came to a point where I felt I didn't understand her at all, and I didn't know her. And that was very difficult, challenging. And I can't know how she experienced the breakup and my reporting, but I would be very curious. And I would love, she's a journalist herself, and I would love to read her account, of what happened.
We wanted to roll back now to your early life and your kind of initial gravitation towards journalism and writing. So is it right that you grew up in Dubai and then you actually studied mathematics at university?
That's true. Yes, I did study. I studied abstract algebra. Like many Indian children, you're kind of directed towards medicine or engineering. And in my case, sort of to the pure sciences. And so I ended up studying a lot of math and physics. And I continued those studies at university. And it was only at university I happened to take a writing seminar one semester. And we were asked to write two short stories over the course of a semester. And I was sitting in my desk at university, writing the first short story. And at some point I had this moment where I realized I was 20 years old, and I realized this is what I want to do with my life. And I'm studying I remember a few days later, I was walking down the street with my best friend, and I told him, Josh, I found what I want to do. I don't know how I'm going to do it because I'm studying mathematics and I want to write. So I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I'll find a way. And so that's one of the reasons after graduating from university, I bought a one-way ticket to Kinshasa, and with no journalism experience, tried to turn myself into a reporter, learn journalism, and start writing. And I became a stringer for the Associated Press, the American news agency. It's an experience I sort of describe in my first book, Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo.
Could you outline for any listeners who aren't familiar with the sort of journalistic terminology what a stringer is and how it works and how you get paid, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So I guess stringer, is a freelance journalist. You're paid by the word. I was paid 10 cents per published word. There's no health insurance. There's no, real expenses paid. You're kind of on your own. There's no real support for anything except the 10 cents a word. And there are, I think what's interesting is that a lot of our news is produced around the world by such stringers who are working in very difficult, underpaid conditions, but reporting essential news, in my case, from the greatest war in the world since the deadliest war in the world since World War II, with I believe the current death toll is close to 6 million people since the Congo War began in 1996. And yet, it's across a territory the size of Western Europe, France, Germany, the UK, Portugal, Germany, Italy, all put together. That's how big the Congo is, even though it doesn't look so big on the map. And yet, when I showed up, I was the fourth international reporter on a territory of that size. It's unreal that wars of that scale that are currently ongoing in our world get such little media attention, and also so few resources directed to covering them properly from the major news organizations in the world. One of the moments that sort of drove me to travel to the Congo was, at university, I was at Yale and I was studying mathematics, and I thought I was going to become a mathematics professor. But I was at lunch one day and I was rushing to my next class, and I opened the New York Times, and in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a little article about the Congo War, in which it said that at that time, 4 million people had been killed. And it kind of blew my mind that this little article was buried somewhere in the newspaper, and that it wasn't on the front page. And that was one of the important moments for me that I began to investigate more and then plan to travel to Congo. And then, with this idea that there's stuff happening there that needs to be reported and that isn't being published in the way that I think it should. And that's still the case today. Many of the major wars, especially in Central Africa, just pass mostly unreported in obscurity.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures. Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes. So I was a stringer in Africa as well for Reuters and in West Africa. But one thing I sort of always thought was interesting about it was that, I mean, it's exactly as you say, that like, you have no support and all this stuff. At the same time, it does provide you with opportunities as a young person that you would not necessarily get if you were elsewhere. I mean, and I remember I met my bosses twice in 2 years and things. But the thing I found fascinating was this line about like, where responsibility happens. Because like you, Reuters didn't insure me, although I think they did give me some money to buy insurance. It was slightly blurred. And I remember we later had on the podcast a very senior executive from Reuters who said, we would always take care of people who are working for us and stuff like that. But obviously that, what that means in practice is difficult. But what, I suppose, both at the time and in retrospect, do you think about, that kind of deal that like you have no support, but you can also kind of make a name for yourself and things like that?
Yeah, there was a great sense of adventure, right? There's a great sense of possibility of opportunity as well. Very little competition in a story as important as the Congo, very little competition journalistically. So as a 22-year-old who just graduated, great sense of freedom to cover this vast country and do reporting that I felt was important. Reuters is a bit better. It's a little bit better than the other agencies. Stringers tend to be somewhere along the spectrum towards being a super stringer, even if they don't have a full-time contract, and even if it's still very precarious, the working conditions. But I believe that given that there are dozens, hundreds of stringers around the world reporting from on the peripheries of the world, what we might call the peripheries, important stories. I think there's a huge untapped opportunity of people like you and me who, were hungry to write great stories, to go out at great risk without the idea of that we would save or earn a great deal of money. We're just hungry to do the kind of reporting that inspired us. I think news organizations have a great opportunity to get wonderful stories for very little extra cost. When news organizations, they say that they're in a crisis, they don't have money. I understand that. I understand that the media landscape is shifting, but I also partly don't believe them. I feel like a lot of the money is misallocated to expensive correspondent trips for celebrity reporters who parachute in and out of countries like the Congo or regions like West Africa. And in reality, there are dozens of stringers who are living in these places, who have invested time and energy into understanding these countries, from living in them, living among the communities that they're reporting on. And I think that produces journalism of the highest order. And news organizations would do well to invest in stringers and local journalists, procure and provide the news that we read. I think it's just an enormous missed opportunity, and I've sort of mentioned this a few times over the last 20 years, and I haven't seen that much change. There are a few more organizations dedicated to sort of providing psychological or insurance or some other kinds of support to stringers and freelancers, especially since the death of James Foley, who was killed in Syria while he was reporting as a freelance journalist, and people became more aware of the risks that stringers and freelance journalists take, often without oversight. That's the flip side. So there's a little more support now, but I still think there's an enormous opportunity to produce great news, and that isn't being tapped into.
Do you think all of that also inevitably makes it a kind of young person's game? Sort of linking back to the theme of your book, it's hard to have that kind of lifestyle and also be paid that amount and have a family and sort of set up a solid base for yourself.
Completely. But I did meet a couple of, freelance photographers in Congo who were slightly older, who'd had careers in Europe or the US and had savings that they could rely on. And they just wanted a change of career, sort of maybe a midlife crisis that sort of they just shifted career quite drastically. So I think it's possible, young and old, certainly in my case, my experience in Stringer that I sort of describe is a coming of age story. My desire to be someone in the world, to become someone, to make something of myself. And that coming of age story, in my case, just happens to happen against the backdrop of this enormous war that, isn't reported very well. And much of the first book, Stringer, I spend describing my own struggle to survive, to sell news. But in trying to figure out how to sell news, I'm also trying to understand what makes the news and what doesn't. Because a lot of what the Congolese saw as news and the stories they passed down in their families or, recounted at bars or, stories that were told in society by my friends were very different from the stories that I reported. And if journalists write the first drafts of history that then historians pick up on, then what kind of country, what was I reporting? What picture was I painting of this country if it was so different from what Congolese experienced? So all of these questions I interrogate in the book. And a lot of the book Stringer is about my journeys, about the stories that didn't make it to the news that I felt were important, and stories that I chased down that I, wasn't successful in reporting or that turned out to be non-stories. And also the making of the news. How do you go to these places? How do you end up meeting a warlord who is threatening a town and reporting on that person when everyone's telling you not to go there and when it's quite, information about the warlord is quite scarce. It felt like describing adventures on the edge of the journalistic world to me.
And then how did you move from being a stringer in the DRC to writing books? We really like on the show to get into the mechanics of this. So how did you go about getting an agent and a publishing deal and stuff like that?
Oh, good question. Yes, so I reported in Congo for a year and a half. I reported on the elections in Congo, presidential elections in 2006. And this was the first free election in Congo in 40 years since the independence hero Patrice Lumumba had been elected and then been assassinated. And then, country had known 32 years of dictatorship. And so it felt like a historic election, historic moment. I reported on that and then decided that it was time to leave. And as I was leaving Congo, I traveled through Nairobi, which is a journalist hub. And I met a friend, a mentor at the New York Times. And I just mentioned to him that I had met all these incredible characters, inspiring people. I wanted to write a book compiling profiles of these incredible people. And all he said to me was, wouldn't it be more compelling if you connected all those profiles with a narrative thread, some kind of story? And I heard him and I thought, he's absolutely right. And I spent the next 3 years trying to discover or figure out what that story could be. To your answer about the mechanics of it, I wrote the book without an agent, without a publisher. I just wrote it from money I'd saved up and, bought some time. And my friend at the New York Times, he kindly allowed me to, offered his contact so I could meet his agent. So I was traveling through New York. I happened to meet his agent. His agent was encouraging. He said to me, he read a few pages that I'd written and he said, there's always a place for good writing. And, you should go ahead and write this book. I believe in you. And so I spent the next 4 years writing Stringer. And when I finished it, I sent it back to the agent and he said to me, I can't publish, I can't sell this. So it was kind of a kind of anticlimactic and very distressing. And then it was really hard actually to sell Stringer. I had rejections from dozens of publishers and agents. And in the end, what happened was I sent it to, one of the biggest publishers in New York at the time. His name was Sunny Mehta, and he was a publisher of Knopf, a division of Random House, and he published a lot of authors whom I loved, V.S. Naipaul, Kapuczynski, Toni Morrison. And I just cold emailed him. And I found his email on the internet and I just cold emailed him and told him I'd written a book. And he's notorious for not replying. He was notorious. He's passed away. He passed away during the pandemic. But he was notorious for not replying to even his famous authors. But for some reason, I guess he replied to me. He liked my email or something and he replied to me. And a month later, he said he liked my book and that's how I got published. It was kind of a cold email. And I still do that nowadays. I still do that sometimes. I sort of email people whom I think might have a connection with, and ask if we can collaborate.
Heartening reminder not to be put off doing that. When people turned you down, did they give a particular reason? Was it the same things you were talking about in terms of not thinking it's a story, or it won't have appeal, or it won't sell, and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think stories about Africa are still, hard to sell. I find readers are interested, but for whatever reason, I find publishers, people in the middle seem reluctant and to hesitate about the economics, and the people in the marketing divisions and sales divisions often chime in and say, there's no market for Africa, or the market's really small. I didn't see my 3 books I've written are set in Central Africa, but, I see them as I've mentioned, more universal stories, coming of age stories, or in the case of the Rwanda book, my second book, Bad News, Last Journalists in a Dictatorship. It's about Rwandan journalists whom I taught, who took on a powerful state and tried to report on abuses of power. And for me, these are, universal stories that deserve to be told. But for whatever reason, many publishers seem to feel that African characters, African protagonists, people in the West, which are the main sort of book markets, won't relate to these characters just because they're African. And I guess I beg to differ. Those are the kinds of conversations I often had. One agent, I remember, a friend's agent, one of the first I'd sent to, he told me I needed to big myself up more. Those were his words. He was like, you need to make yourself more of a hero in your books. And that struck me also as wrong. I've had a range of responses, but often it's to do with commercial considerations. I would say that's a common thread.
And over the last 10 years or so, alongside these reporting and writing commitments, how have you structured your life, and how have you made it work financially? That's always something we ask on the podcast. I saw that when you were in Rwanda, you were kind of training local journalists, right?
Yeah, I think the honest answer, it's a very important question, because, more and more I feel that journalism is more and more, it feels to me, difficult to make self-sustaining financially. And, articles pay $400. It doesn't pay for the gas, the petrol to travel, to make a reporting trip. It's really quite difficult. And I think the high level answer that I would give you is my reporting and my books allow me to live in cheaper countries or cities. So I'm now living in Mexico. I was living in Cambodia. I was living, in Rwanda and Congo. In such places, my books and my reporting can sustain, I can sustain myself from my writing. But for bigger questions, it's far more complicated. I have a daughter now, and, I have to think about her education. And if I want to buy a house, if I want to think about my pension, my retirement, I don't find that my books and writing allow me to finance those. And so, yes, it becomes important I've done some teaching. I did some TV reporting. I got lucky. So a producer called me and asked me if I would present some TV shows, and TV pays a lot better. Anything on screen pays better. So I've been fortunate in those ways. But I've also studied this question that you just asked, and I found that many writers find a home at a university. And that's something that I'm now pursuing, that I'm thinking about, sort of trying to find some institutional connection with a university where I can teach remotely, allowing me to travel, but also, maybe fly a couple of times a year, teach in person, and contribute to university's research and journalistic programs or writing programs. And I feel like that might be a more sustainable way to have some kind of university position that gives me some stable income, and then also allows me freedom to structure my time to, follow the issues that I think are important, whether it's in the Central African Republic or the Democratic Republic of the Congo or, Rwanda. I think it's an immense privilege, actually, to live in this way where I can, decide for myself, even if editors don't agree with me, decide for myself what the important stories of our age are, or, stories that I think should be reported, and to dedicate time and energy and my physical presence to going and reporting them as well as I can.
You mentioned Kapuscinski and Naipaul as influences. What is it about their work in particular that speaks to you? And sort of relatedly, how did it feel when reviews of your books have compared your writing to theirs?
I think the reason I was drawn to them was because both of them, to different degrees than to me, put themselves in their stories. They told me a little bit about who they were. I had a sense that Kapuscinski was, didn't have a lot of money. He was like a stringer. I felt like I could relate to him. Wasn't writing for very important, newspapers, but I had a sense for what motivated him to do his reporting. And Naipaul as well. One of his stories, Unlocked Stringer. There was a story that I read called "The Crocodiles of Yamoussoukro" about the Ivory Coast, in which he wrote in this very beautiful paragraph about how he had a French teacher at school, a very elegant African French teacher with an elegant headdress. And she was so beautiful, he sort of fallen in love with her. And he wanted to go to the Ivory Coast. He was kind of inspired by her to go to the Ivory Coast to see where these elegant women came from. And I thought, in reading that, I thought, wow, you're allowed to do this? Like, you're allowed to begin your journey at such a personal moment. But of course, these are the kinds of moments that inspire us and move us. And I felt like I understood why they were going there. As I sort of had mentioned, often when I'm watching documentaries or reading a journalistic account, I'm wondering, who the reporter is. And in traditional forms of journalism, you don't get that. And so I felt some kind of kinship with them. And I think I just, for the comparisons, I just feel lucky. Sunny Mehta, he had published them, but I thought he might be sensitive to my work. But yeah, I just think it's chance. I also think that, there are very few Indian or Indian origin reporters who have reported on Africa or reported around the world. And so maybe there's some of that sort of reflexive thinking when people read my work. They're like, oh, this is like Naipaul. He was also brown and he also traveled the world. So I take comparisons like that with a pinch of salt.
A big question that's arisen about Kapuscinski in recent years is this whole question of whether or to what extent he fictionalized stuff. And that's something that a conversation that we've had with other more travel writers, I suppose, than journalists. But as someone who is writing these narratives in which you're present, and which have some overlay with travel reportage, what's your view on the line and what is permissible in terms of fictionalization?
Yeah, I think, the criticisms of Kapuscinski are, I think, well-founded. And I believe there was a piece in the Times Literary Supplement that went into some detail. They seem very convincing. It seems very, probable that he fictionalized many of his scenes. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think it's wrong. I think he should have, told readers or indicated to readers that he'd made up those interviews or those scenes entirely. What I like about Kapuscinski was, an interview of him that I read before I went to Congo motivated me to begin these journeys. And I liked his motivations. Yeah, in this interview with Granta magazine, I believe it was with Bill Buford, he said at one point, I was traveling through Africa. There were this is him speaking, he was traveling through Africa through these coups d'etats, revolutions, and there was human history unfolding before his eyes, real-time history. And he asked, where were the philosophers? Where were the poets? Where were the writers? All these people who purport to write about the human condition. He said, it was just me and a couple of reporters there. And he said, then I went back to Europe, and there I found them in their cozy apartments writing about a boy, a girl, the laughter, the kiss, the divorce, the same story we've heard many, many times. And that resonated with me hugely. He felt fundamentally that what was happening in these African countries was human history was important, was our shared history, and deserved to be written about as part of the human condition, as reflections on the human condition, as much as any other, war or event in Europe or Russia or the United States. And so there was a sense of equal importance for a region like Africa, and that resonated with me. And I think this idea that if nobody else is going to go and do it, then maybe I can contribute something. I think that's what I took from him.
It's a very nerdy question, and a nod to the podcast's name. But when you're reporting, how do you go about gathering your material? I know you use a notebook, but do you also have an audio recorder, and how do you kind of balance the two?
Yeah, it's tricky. I use an audio recorder, especially when I'm dealing with official sources, because I feel like I don't want to, often when I'm interviewing official sources, it's to hold them accountable because they have power. I feel like that's the fundamental job of journalism, to hold power accountable. And journalism does other things. Journalism entertains, it informs. But I feel like all those other functions that journalism serves don't mean much if we're not holding power accountable. And so often when I'm with figures of power, I'll make sure to record, because if I get something from them. If I get them to say something or admit to, complicity in a crime or something, I want to have that on the record irrefutably. I think it's trickier when I'm trying to get people to share more sensitive stories. In Rwanda, I took a lot of notes on my phone. I took a lot of notes on my hand because I felt like a government source was watching me. I felt like the people I was talking to were afraid to talk to a journalist, afraid to have their voice recorded because they felt it somehow identified them. I remember one case, I was sitting next to a boy in Rwanda, at a very young boy. He was like maybe 15 or something. And he was at an election campaign rally. And he didn't want to say anything to me at all. So I said to him, hey, I don't want to know your name. I don't want to know anything about you. I'm going to hand you this piece of paper. Can you write for me everything that you want to tell me? And there's no way for me to trace you, but I want to know what you think so I can write about it. And I think that for me, that was a powerful moment because it showed that, many of the journalistic norms that we need to know what their names are, or how old they are, they can actually do a disservice and go against our mission to report on the truth, to help people feel comfortable enough to tell us what they really feel and think. And of course, we have to then go and verify what they say because part of the reason we ask them their names is for accountability. But in some cases, I think as journalists, maybe we need to take more of the risk, especially if we're foreign correspondents and aren't so much at risk of the government attacking us or killing us or attacking our families. Instead of making our sources take the risk, then maybe we can take on more of that burden ourselves.
You just inspired me actually to go and check my voice recorder. This is equally nerdy, but I have moved from using a voice recorder to using my phone now that iPhones have longer batteries. And I'd already written off one voice recorder because it was untouched for a while and its own batteries leaked. But I can confirm to you and to podcast listeners that the batteries have not leaked in my Olympus. So I'm relieved. I wanted to ask again a kind of publishing industry question in that your latest book is published by Hearst, so a sort of very well regarded but quite small independent publisher. How did that come about? And compared to dealing with this sort of published New York Titan with your earlier books, what has been the relative merits of being published by them?
After I got published by Sunny Mehta in the US, after he passed away during the pandemic, it was almost as if I was back to square one. It was, again, incredibly hard to have Breakup be published. I found I had to really search for publishers whom I felt were committed to the literary project. Like, what is literature? To asking, what is literature? What are literature's limitations? And what should literature be writing about? And can we expand the boundaries of literature? Can we, and think about it in that way? And since Sunny's passing, it's unfortunate, but many publishers I found, especially with the corporatization of the publishing industry, I think there's a lot of talk of commercial considerations. And I've spoken to my fellow writers who, report the same. Even elder writers who've been published for the last 30 years, they've noticed how in recent years the conversations have really changed, and the commercial viability of a book is really at the fore of a publishing house's decision to publish or not. Other writers have told me that in publishing meetings, the editors used to have a lot of the power, and now marketing and sales teams really have a lot more power in deciding even whether a book gets published or not. And so I really wanted to publish Breakup because it's the third book in the trilogy. It's an independent book. The story stands alone. But if I've told the stories of what's happened in Congo, Rwanda, and the Central African Republic through my own life, it also brought me a sense of closure because it describes, in the first book, Stringer, I meet Natalie, my ex-wife, and in Breakup, we separate. So it comes, natural end of a journey, relationship with her. And so I really wanted to publish it, but I had to look for publishers who, really were committed to some of the older values in publishing. And I'm pleased to say that, there are some great publishers like Hearst. And in India, my book will be published by Simon & Schuster. But yes, I had to do a lot of work to publish this book, in particular because there is no market for the Central African Republic in the English-speaking publishing world. And, even the French-speaking world, it's really small. As I mentioned, Henri Gide was the last writer to have published a book. It was 1927. So in 100 years, there's no readership that is developed around this country. And yet for me, that felt like the achievement and the interest. And so it makes for me, publishing a book is always hard, I think, but unless you're writing something incredibly commercial. But for me, it made the challenge of publishing this book worthwhile, because I felt that I was, telling a story that needed to be told and that hadn't been for a long, long time.
We're coming towards the end of our time. So as a final question from me, what do your future plans involve? You've touched on potentially getting involved in academia, but what's on the horizon for you?
Sure. Yes, I think I'd like to be in academia more to have a base to teach and share what I've learned and exchange also with younger reporters. But right now I'm living in Mexico. I'm reporting on environmental defenders there. 80% of the biodiversity left in our world is in the hands of 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples. And Mexico is the deadliest country for indigenous land defenders in the world, 54 killed last year. And so I'm traveling around the country and writing about communities that are protecting a mountain, a forest, a river, and yet they don't get reported on for a variety of reasons. They're poor, they're isolated often, and often there's racism against indigenous people, so they've never really featured in the news in their own countries. And now moving towards environmental conflict reporting. And I think these are some of the bravest people in the world, and their stories deserve to be told. And so that's what I've been dedicating myself to over the past couple of years in Mexico.
Great. Well, that seems a good point to draw this to a close. Thank you very much for being a great guest and always take notes and speaking with such candor about your various projects, and wishing you all the best with Breakup and with everything else going forward.
Appreciate you having me on the show.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Anjan Sundaram. He's on Twitter at Anjan Sun, and Breakup is published by Hearst. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Anjan?
Well, we've had a few war reporters on the show. I was thinking of Sebastian Younger and Alex Perry, who was like before my time, and Christina Lamb. And all of them have spoken very candidly and evocatively about what that experience has been like for them and the repercussions of that. And obviously, Anjan is someone who's written about it and really thought about it at length. So it was great to get his sort of self-reflexive take on the costs of his work. And I was also struck by his anecdote with the boy and the piece of paper and what it means to get the truth in those sort of scenarios. How about you?
I enjoyed talking to him because, I've been a stringer in Africa, so it was really interesting to hear his take on it and also see how he'd kind of translated that into literature, really. And, all those points about the kind of precarity of it and the kind of unclear who's going to come help you out if things go wrong and all of that stuff that I'm definitely familiar with. And I've been aware of his work for a while, so it was, really, really good interview to add. But also, very clear from him the significant emotional and personal toll that this stuff has taken. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what has your cultural diet been of late?
Well, I'm working, as you are, working my way through Nicholas Shakespeare's biography of Ian Fleming ahead of our interview with him at Hatchards. And I feel like I'm struggling for good television at the minute. So if any listeners have any good recommendations, let me know. But that's mostly it, to be honest. I have also just returned from Paris, where I am still mourning the semi-final result of England-South Africa. But yes, that's mostly what I've been up to. How about you? You've been climbing. You survived. You survived your climbing trip.
I did. I went. I was in North Wales, sort of South North Wales, on a climbing trip, but was also sort of small act of pilgrimage for my new book project, because in that I'm writing about a fascinating man called Arnold Lunn, who, among other things, invented the slalom, but he broke his leg on a mountain called Cadair Idris in 1909, and I went back to the precise place where it had happened without breaking my leg, so that was good. In terms of matters cultural, I've also been reading Nicholas Shakespeare's biography of Ian Fleming in preparation for this live recording that we're doing, and then I read a bunch of magazine stuff. So I read Ruth Margalit, I think that's her name, who wrote a very powerful account for The New Yorker of the attacks in Israel. In the print issue of The New Yorker, I read Nathan Heller's piece on the decline of San Francisco and whether or not it is declining, and also a piece on the war crimes tribunals in Japan after the war. So it was a kind of heavy diet of American magazine journalism this week. And as I was saying off air, my new bookshelves are being fitted tomorrow, which is something that I'm very excited about. So,
but you're not going to take James Daunt's advice about the angles and lighting and things.
No,
You're just
but this is not a retail situation, Rachel. So I think the angle is less. Because I would also be concerned.
You might want to show them off when we're interviewing people on Zoom. That is
true, but I would be concerned with an angle that they could potentially slide off. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.